profound admiration for your contributions to the world of literature and politics, we extend a formal invitation to Mr. Prabhat Patnaik, noted Indian magazine economist and political commentator, to deliver a speech at our prestigious event. Your participation will undoubtedly elevate the intellectual ambience of our gathering. Welcome, sir.
Friends and colleagues, first, of course, I would like to thank the organizers of this festival for inviting me to speak here, even though I am an economist and don't really have much to do directly with literature or any creative activity. It is, however, a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers for it. There is all over the world a shift that is taking place to the right. That is unmistakable. The shift is occurring to a point where in many countries, people are either threatening to elect or even have elected governments that are extremely right-wing. Normally, the press in the advanced countries and the liberal intelligentsia refers to these governments as populist governments of the right, right-wing populism. Now, for reasons which would become clear, which I would like to explain in the course of my talk, I believe that that is in fact a misleading characterization of these governments. Whether we are talking about India, or we are talking about Italy, or we are talking about Argentina, or we are talking about Brazil under Bolsonaro, or we are talking about US under Trump, or we are talking about Hungary, or we are talking about Germany, which is threatening with the AFD becoming more significant over time, or France, where currently Marine Le Pen enjoys a rating, a popularity rating that is even greater than President Macron. Now, all these countries and all these movements, which are referred to as right-wing populism, are movements which I believe are misleadingly described by that term. They actually have a lot of familiarity, similarity with one another, and what is more, they also have a lot of similarity with the movements that had emerged in the 1930s, which we know under the name of fascism. Now, there are, of course, very important differences between the 1930s fascism and contemporary fascism, contemporary movements of this kind, which have a family resemblance to 1930s fascism. Because of these differences, I would like to describe the current movements as neo-fascism. In this, I'm following a trend which is set by Cornel West, the American black philosopher who, to my knowledge, has used this term. So what I really wish to discuss is the emergence, the origin of neo-fascism and why it has suddenly become fashionable. The characteristics of neo-fascism, which are normally recognized, are of course quite well known. Firstly, it entails state repression against opponents, against the intelligentsia, both liberal and left, against democratic public opinion, against the free press, against anyone who dares to oppose the regime. So state repression is, of course, a very common feature of all these movements. At the same time, these movements generally tend to undermine or destroy democratic institutions, not just as a matter of chance, but essentially because they literally do not believe in the principles of liberal democracy. That most of these governments are governments that basically believe that all people are not of equal worth or equal standing, and therefore democracy, which actually falsely equates them in terms of the power they enjoy as citizens, is in fact an erroneous concept. The third feature of all these movements is that they combine state repression with street thuggery. And it is this that fascism in the 1930s was not just repression, it was a movement. And likewise today, in most of these countries, what you find is a movement that is fomented by these kinds of groups, and these movements actually combine street thuggery. I mean, Italy's Mussolini's fascism was actually a movement. They combine street thuggery with state repression. They have their own thugs, but additionally, they use state repression. The most important feature, of course, is the fourth one, which is that there is an otherization of a hapless minority group, which is presented as the other. And that minority group is one against whom hatred is generated within the majority, and that in fact becomes the decisive discourse of all these movements. It could be a religious minority like in our country, it could be an ethnic minority, it could be the immigrants, etc. But whatever it is, there's always, in all these movements, there is always the other that is the hated other, the hateful other, and that is the one that is really becomes the focus of attention. The other feature, which is something which is not, which again is very common, is the cult of the leader. That essentially, and this is part of the reason why all these movements are fundamentally anti-democratic, because the people are supposed to surround the leader and derive their power, derive their authority from the authority of the leader, as opposed to the very opposite, which is the basic presumption behind democracy. Democracy implies that it's the people who are powerful, and whoever happens to enjoy their trust and confidence is the one that actually acts in their name, that therefore derives his or her power from them, while here an attempt is made to project the leader as the source of all power, and the people only stand in reflected glory of the leader. All these are fairly common, well-known traits of all these regimes, but the traits which are normally not discussed is that every one of these regimes is very closely aligned with big business and with monopoly capital. In fact, not just with monopoly capital, but in fact with a particular new segment of monopoly capital. The very well-known book by the French anarchist writer Daniel Guérin, who actually wrote a book called Fascism and Big Business, argued that Hitler's movement, basically, that in Germany at that time, there were two different layers among big business. There was the old layer among big business, which was located in the traditional old industries, while there was a new layer which was much more located in armaments, steel, and so on. And the fascist movement actually based itself, derived its sustenance from the latter in particular. But of course, the fact that he derived sustenance from the latter in particular does not mean that he did not enjoy the support of monopoly capital. Very close relationship between monopoly capital on the one hand and these fascist movements on the other hand is a hallmark of fascism. This you see in our country, this you see everywhere. As a matter of fact, many of you may have seen Luchino Visconti's film The Damned, which actually showed the relationship between layers of big business and the Nazi leadership. But this is an aspect which is typically not highlighted in a lot of the liberal discussion of fascism. Now, if you say instead of fascism, right-wing populism, in that case, the suggestion is that it is a movement that appeals to the people against the elite. But as a matter of fact, it's a movement that is so closely aligned with monopoly capital, with the elite of the big business, that you find that description of it as a populist movement. Yes, populism, of course, is an instrument it uses, but fundamentally, in class terms, it's a movement that is pushed forward by the support of the very top among the business elite. And for that reason, right-wing populism is in fact a wrong way to look at these movements. Exactly the same is true when we talk about, or when liberal writers talk about extreme nationalism. Nowhere in the world has any of these governments, whenever in power or whenever threatening to come to power, has made any claim that it is going to put a stop to the free mobility, free cross-country mobility of capital. If you're talking about nationalism, if you're talking about a nation, then the nation, in order to be able to decide its own destiny, to decide its own fate, must therefore have a control area, an area over which its government's writ runs. But if a country is open to global capital flows, in that case, suppose the government does something which global capital does not like, it will flow out in large numbers, because of which there will be a financial crisis and the government would be forced to withdraw what it was doing. Therefore, national sovereignty is undermined by global capital flows, particularly global financial flows that in a jiffy can take billions of dollars out of your country. Because of that, if these movements were nationalist movements, then the first thing they would be thinking about is imposing controls on financial flows, imposing controls on capital flows. But no such movement has done or is threatening to do. Even Trump, who talked a lot about protecting the US against Chinese imports and so on, is never talked about controlling financial flows into and out of the United States. Since globalization of finance is a real key hallmark of neoliberalism, none of these governments or none of these movements has really ever taken a stand against this key element of neoliberalism. As a matter of fact, I would argue that these movements are promoted by the very fact of neoliberalism. Not only are they not anti-neoliberal, but they actually arise in the context of neoliberalism. You see, neoliberalism, or for that matter, any particular economic regime, no matter how repressive the political form may be that sustains such a regime, every such regime, no matter how repressive, requires some kind of an ideological prop in order to provide its ethical justification. Every regime wants to justify itself ethically. And this ethical justification, even the most right-wing regime, this ethical justification is something which is provided by some kind of an ideological prop. Now, the ideological prop of neoliberalism was that it was going to bring so much growth, everybody is going to become better off, that actually there'd be so much money in people's bank accounts and so on and so forth. That typically it promised milk and honey to the people at large. Now that of course never materialized, but on the other hand, even though it did not materialize, there was always the propaganda that, look, your time will come. All right, at the moment you have not gained, but wait till tomorrow, wait till day after tomorrow, your time will come. That basically sooner or later, very high rates of growth that we are having, their benefits would trickle down to everybody, and so that everybody is going to become better off, and therein lies the superiority of neoliberalism. That was the ideological prop which was used by neoliberalism for a very long time. But of course, with the crisis of neoliberalism, and I'll discuss the crisis in a moment, with the crisis of neoliberalism, that ideological prop collapses. Because if it is the case that growth is slow, if it is the case that unemployment is in fact growing by leaps and bounds, like for instance the level of unemployment today is higher in India than ever, than at any time since independence, if that is the case, then you cannot really promise people that, look, better times are coming. Because of course the current times they live in are so abysmal that they then can scarcely be enticed with the vision of a bright and promising future. Therefore, the old ideological prop that supported neoliberalism collapses in a period of neoliberal crisis. Therefore, in a neoliberal crisis period, you require some kind of an alternative ideological prop. That alternative ideological prop is provided by neo-fascism. Therefore, you have an alliance between neoliberalism and neo-fascism, which concretely takes the form in our country of a corporate Hindutva alliance, that you actually have an alliance between the forces of neoliberalism and the forces of neo-fascism. Neo-fascist elements exist in every modern society. In America, Ku Klux Klan has existed for decades. In India, you have had RSS for a very long period. You have had all kinds of such groups, neo-fascist groups or semi-fascist or actual fascist groups you have had in every modern society, but they typically remain in the fringes of politics. They come center stage only when they are offered financial help and media support by the corporate rich. The corporate rich control the media, and therefore they provide media support to these elements. And what is more, they also provide financial support to these elements. That's when these elements start moving center stage. And they move center stage, and the reason, the basis for this alliance between neoliberalism and neo-fascism is that it provides a new prop for neoliberalism by changing the discourse. It provides an alternative discourse. It provides a discourse of hatred against a minority. People get absorbed in this new discourse. Just imagine, as I mentioned a moment ago, that the unemployment situation in India today is worse than at any time since independence. But on the other hand, what is the discourse currently the nation is engaged in? Some temple being built in Ayodhya. So it is the diversionary discourse that is of great benefit as far as the corporate bourgeoisie is concerned, as far as the big bourgeoisie is concerned. In fact, Michal Kalecki, the well-known Polish economist, had defined fascism as a partnership between big business and fascist upstarts. That partnership, that alliance between big business and, of course, these fascist elements, in our case, the Hindutva elements, elsewhere, other kinds of chauvinist elements, whether it's ethnic and so on, is the core of fascism. Not only does it provide a diversionary discourse where issues of bread and butter, issues of material conditions of life, issues of unemployment, issues of real wage, and so on, are no longer center stage, but what is more, this kind of a spread of hatred also divides the working people. It divides the working class. Therefore, the prospects of a combined working class onslaught on this order, on this injustice that is particularly visited upon the working class in a period of economic crisis, is something which is kept at bay. And of course, at the same time, what you find is that unemployment, for instance, produces an army of lumpens who can be easily mobilized in order to carry out the work of these fascist groups, as I mentioned, the street thuggery that the fascist groups always engage in. Therefore, the crisis of neoliberalism provides the opportunity for neo-fascism, provides the basis for the alliance between neoliberalism and neo-fascism. This is exactly what had happened in the 1930s. The crisis of world capitalism of the 1930s, the Great Depression, had provided, the huge unemployment it generated all over Europe, had provided the basis for the strengthening of the fascist elements who had then been very helpful to the big bourgeoisie in changing the discourse, altering the discourse to be against the Jews and so on. The Jews were the hated community. So this is a common phenomenon which we find whenever capitalism enters into a crisis. You find that this kind of an alternative ideological prop by forming an alliance with neo-fascism becomes the order of the day. But that is not all. That's only half the story. Walter Benjamin, the well-known German literary critic, had actually made the point that fascism arises on the basis of a failed revolution. He, of course, was talking about Germany in the 1930s. As you know, throughout the 1920s, the German Communist Party tried to, create revolutionary situations to overthrow the system, starting from Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, their Spartacist uprising. All of these revolutionary attempts in Germany were actually crushed. So the fact that the working class had got demoralized, the fact that actually the most advanced elements of working class that were associated with these revolutionary attempts to overthrow the system had got crushed, is something that provided the basis for the emergence of fascism. In other words, while the soil for the emergence of fascism arises because of the crisis of capitalism, the possibility of the emergence of fascism arises precisely in a period in which the working class is on the defensive. Now, neoliberalism has produced a situation where the working class all over the world is on the defensive. Why? Because now we live in a world in which the workers are organized only on a national level. We have the trade union congresses, All India Trade Union Congress, Center for Indian Trade Unions, and all trade unions are organized on a national basis, by and large. But on the other hand, capital is globalized, finance is globalized. In America, for instance, forget about India, even in America, for instance, if the workers go on a strike demanding higher real wages, then the capitalists tell them, oh, you're on strike, then we're going to locate our next plant in Indonesia or in Bangladesh or somewhere else. Therefore, capital is globalized, but the workers are nationally organized. Because of this, the weakness of workers' bargaining strength is obvious, and because of this weakness, they're in a position not just to let alone think of any resistance or revolutionary uprising, they are not even in a position to demand higher wages. So much so that in the United States, according to an estimate made by Joseph Stiglitz, who got a Nobel Prize in economics, if you look at the average wage of a male American worker in 2011 and compare it with the average real wage of a male American worker in 1968, then the 2000 level is slightly lower. Now that shows, even in the United States, I mean obviously it had gone up and then come down, that shows that even in the United States, there has been no secular improvement in the condition of the workers, and that is indicative of the weakness of the working class, not just in America, but all over the world, because nationally organized workers are facing global capital and therefore global finance. Now, it is in this situation where the working class, think of our own country. 30 years ago, you had such powerful trade union movements, but where have they all gone? Now, there are at least three reasons why under neoliberalism you actually find that the trade unions get smashed. One I've already discussed, because individual, nationally organized workers face globalized capital. Secondly, the workers are always much more powerful in public sector units than in private sector units. In the United States, for instance, only about 7% of the workers in private units are organized into unions, while in public units, if you include education, the proportion of workers organized into unions is about 1/3. 30% or above. Therefore, they're always much more powerfully organized in public sector units, and therefore the dismantling of the public sector, which is one of the features of neoliberalism, becomes then one very important reason for the weakness of the trade union movement. Therefore, you find that the striking power of the working class has gone down greatly all over the world, including in our country. In the very recent period in Europe, there have been some working class struggles which are quite noteworthy, but nothing like the strength that the workers used to have earlier. And certainly one reason why, in France, for instance, you have even now fairly powerful trade unions compared to other countries, because in France, privatization of public sector units has not gone far enough. But on the other hand, in France, again, legislation is coming in to weaken the striking power of the trade unions, just as in our country there has been legislation. Therefore, you find that, as Walter Benjamin had said, that fascism arises on the backs of a failed revolution. Well, one can't say failed revolution in our case, but certainly fascism arises on the backs of a weakening working class strength, and a situation where the working class strength is ebbing away. It is in this context that you have the emergence, of course, of fascism. But on the other hand, why? I said it arises in a period of crisis, but why is there a crisis of neoliberalism? Already I have talked to you about the fact that there's a weakness as far as the working class movement is concerned. Now the American workers can't get higher wages because of the fact that the workers in India, in Vietnam, in China, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, and so on get much lower real wages. They can threaten to shift their units from America to these other countries. At the same time, the shifting of these units does not give rise to an exhaustion of the enormous amount of labor reserves that exist in these countries, which forces the real wages to be close to the subsistence level. In other words, you have, because of our colonial past, the emergence of very substantial labor reserves through the deindustrialization of our economy, and those labor reserves have basically meant that the real wages in countries of the third world have remained more or less tied to a subsistence level. The the advanced country workers were not till now affected by these real wages or by these labor reserves because capital was not very mobile. But on the other hand, now that capital has become mobile, which is the meaning of globalization, contemporary globalization, and which is what neoliberal regimes everywhere have actually brought about, now that capital has become liberalized, you find that the American workers' bargaining strength has gone down. At the same time, the fact of capital shifting, relocating activities in the third world does not use up the labor reserves. Why not? Firstly, because of the fact that neoliberalism entails an agrarian crisis. It entails the withdrawal of state support from peasant agriculture, which was a hallmark of what was of the previous regime. As a matter of fact, in the 1930s, the Indian anti-colonial struggle took off in a very big way. And it took off in a big way because of the fact that there was a crisis where the peasantry got deeply indebted. And the peasantry was really, I mean, if you look at stories by Manik Bandyopadhyay and others, I'm sure in every literature you would find these stories, horrendous stories of peasant distress, which emerged with indebtedness and so on. And that time, the national movement, the anti-colonial struggle, made a promise that come independence, you'd never again face such a situation. As a matter of fact, after independence, therefore, the state came to the aid of the peasantry. I'm not saying that all sections of the peasantry got equally benefited by it, but on the whole, peasant agriculture remained, survived, and was protected and preserved because of state help in very many different ways, from investment in irrigation to bank nationalization and the provision of agricultural credit to the provision of better seeds, high-yielding varieties of seeds developed in public laboratories, to the support and procurement prices for all crops, not just food grains, for cash crops and so on. All these meant a whole framework of support for peasant agriculture, which gets dismantled under neoliberalism. The last bit of dismantling, which the Modi government was trying to do through its three farm laws, has been stalled for the time being because of the peasant agitation. But on the other hand, the moment an opportunity arises, you would find that the last of these would also be carried through. But of course, support for peasant agriculture, for growing cash crops, has been completely withdrawn. I don't have to go very far. In Kerala, look at what is happening to the rubber prices for the growers. Because rubber prices, nobody now, the government of India is not in a position to, under neoliberalism, sustain rubber prices, because of which the growers are in very profound crisis. So, the crisis of peasant agriculture drives lots of peasants out of their traditional occupation into the role of job seekers. Therefore, the reserve army of labor does not get exhausted. It gets replenished by new army of job seekers entering these reserves. In addition, the moment you open up the economy to international trade, there is a competition among producers, namely that you must introduce technological progress. Otherwise, let us say, the Chinese are going to steal your market. You must introduce technological progress, otherwise some other countries' producers will steal your market. In addition, the moment you open up the economy to international trade, there is a competition among producers, namely that you must introduce technological progress. Otherwise, let us say, the Chinese are going to steal your market. You must introduce technological progress, otherwise some other countries' producers will steal your market. Therefore, there is a race among producers to introduce technological change, and under capitalism, all technological change tends to be labor displacing, labor saving. Therefore, you find that labor productivity rises. For any given rate of growth, the higher the rate of growth of labor productivity, the lower is the rate of growth of employment. As a matter of fact, it may come as a surprise to you that even though in India now, it is claimed that the GDP growth rate has doubled compared to what it was before neoliberal reforms were introduced. The annual employment growth has halved compared to what it was before neoliberal reforms were introduced. It was about 2% per annum earlier. Now it's about 1% per annum. Therefore, this looking at GDP growth does not help. And therefore, as I said, you find that wages do not rise either in advanced countries or in the underdeveloped countries. As a matter of fact, once I had to go to Barcelona, I was speaking to a group of trade unionists. So I talked to them about unemployment in India. They were quite flabbergasted. They said, "You have unemployment?" I said, "Yes, of course." They said, "Hey, we thought that we have unemployment because our business has shifted to your country. Therefore, we thought that our unemployment is because your unemployment is disappearing." What they did not visualize is that unemployment can arise there and unemployment can also arise here, and because of the play of neoliberalism. That's exactly what is happening. So if the real wages don't rise, I'm not saying they're equal between America and here, but wherever they are, the real wages, whatever level they are at, they don't rise, labor productivity rises everywhere, then you find that the share of economic surplus in output rises. And of course, since a unit of wage or a unit of working people's income, that means workers, peasants, petty producers, craftsmen, fishermen, and so on, a unit of their income, more of it is spent on consumption than a unit of income accruing a surplus to the rich, to the capitalists, and so on. Because of that, every such redistribution of income has the effect of reducing the level of demand, creating a tendency towards overproduction. This is happening on a world scale. There is a massive tendency towards an overproduction crisis, and that overproduction crisis has actually hit neoliberal capitalism, which is why neoliberal capitalism is now resorting to an alliance with neo-fascism to sustain its ideological prop. But of course, there is a big difference, and this is where I come to the difference between 1930s and now. In the 1930s, when fascism had come to power in countries like Germany and Japan and so on, it had actually got those countries out of the crisis. Why? Because the government spent on armaments, and the government spent on armaments by not taxing anybody, but by borrowing. And therefore, there was no tax on anybody, no reduction in anybody's demand, but a rise in government demand. Therefore, there was an overall rise in aggregate demand, because of which Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Germany was the second country to come out of the Great Depression the moment Hitler came to power in 1933. But in today's world, since the government, in order to spend, let us say, 100 rupees, is not allowed to borrow 100 rupees, because that borrowing is what we call a fiscal deficit, and that is limited by our fiscal responsibility legislation that is imposed upon the government by globalized finance. Globalized finance doesn't want the government to spend by borrowing, to spend by running a fiscal deficit. Globalized finance also doesn't want the government to spend by taxing the rich. And if that is the case, then the choice before the government, the only option before the government, is to spend by taxing the poor, by taxing the working people. But the working people spend all their incomes on consumption anyway. So if you tax them 100 rupees, their consumption goes down by 100 rupees. The government spends those 100 rupees, demand goes up by 100 rupees, but there's no net increase in demand. It has gone down by 100 somewhere, gone up by 100 elsewhere. So for these reasons, contemporary neoliberal capitalism is incapable of overcoming the crisis which it is engaged in within the confines of neoliberalism. That means that the neoliberal crisis cannot be overcome not just by liberal bourgeois governments, it cannot be overcome even by the neo-fascist governments. And that is a point to be noted as far as neo-fascism is concerned. There was a period in Germany between 1933 and 1939 before the horrors of the war had actually visited the German people, when they were quite happy with Hitler. They were happy with the Hitler because he had got rid of unemployment. But on the other hand, war really had not started in a big way. Now, that period in which the Nazis enjoyed some popularity because of their ability to overcome the crisis is something which is not available to neo-fascists today. Which basically means that the neo-fascists may well get voted out of power. They may. I'm not saying they would. They may get voted out of power because, of course, fascists, like limpets, stick to power. But they may get voted out of power. But if they do get voted out of power, since if the government that comes in their place also continues to keep the economy within the crisis, then the fascists can come back. Look at what Trump is doing. Trump had been voted out of power, everybody clapped and was happy, but now Trump is leading, and Trump may well come back as president of the US. Therefore, if you want to get rid of fascism, you have to get rid of the conjuncture that produces fascism, that produces neo-fascism. And that conjuncture is a crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Therefore, you have to get rid of the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. You have to have an agenda to get rid of the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. And I think this is something which the opposition parties trying to build an alliance must keep in mind, that it is not enough for them just to come together. They must provide the people with an alternative that gets them out of the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. How can they do that? I'll just give you one instance and then I'll stop. I made a calculation. The calculation was that suppose, one of the problems with the Indian Constitution is the fact that while it guarantees some fundamental political and civil rights, it does not guarantee any economic rights. All economic provisions of the Constitution are put into the directive principles of state policy, which are not justiciable, which are not binding on any government. Suppose we actually had a set of fundamental economic rights, and I took only 5 fundamental economic rights. The right to food, which basically means that everybody must get food exactly on the same terms as the BPL population used to do in the years before the pandemic. Everybody must have a right to employment, which means that you must get employment, or alternatively, you must be paid a full wage. In other words, providing employment is not your responsibility, or getting employment not your responsibility. If you are unemployed, then that's the fault of society. Thirdly, the right to free, publicly funded health care along a national health service. Fourthly, the right to free, publicly funded quality education through public institutions. And fifth, the right to a living old age pension and disability benefits. And we took 3,000 rupees per month as the old age pension. The calculation was done for 2018. So, if you take this set of 5 fundamental economic rights, in that case, the amount you require to spend on realizing these rights is something which can be financed by just 2 taxes imposed on the top 1% of the population, only on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax, and the other is a 1/3 inheritance tax. That means if I'm going to bequeath my wealth to my child, 100 rupees worth of wealth, then 33 rupees of it must be taken by the state, which is actually lower compared to the rates of wealth taxation, of inheritance taxation that exist in many advanced capitalist countries. Japan, for instance, has a 40% inheritance taxation. Therefore, the idea of providing, I'm not saying all these have to be provided necessarily, but a way forward a way forward has to be shown to the people, which is how you can activate them and defeat fascism, which thrives in this period of neoliberal capitalism's crisis by changing the discourse away from issues of material life into temporal and this and that. Thank you very much. I would like to take some questions. I hope there will be some.
Sir, you mentioned that our workers' union movements are nationally organized. On the other hand, that of the finance forces are globally organized.
Yes.
And you also said that when we want a worker here wants a wage rise, they will threaten that they will relocate to another region or Bangladesh or somewhere else.
Yes.
Sir, my question, a hypothetical question. In this era of hypothetical capital or speculative capital, I am asking you a hypothetical question that if Marx comes again, what would be his panacea for this capitalist paradigm shifts or capitalist stances?
There are two ways in which you can counter it. One way, and by the way, this is based on a concept called centralization of capital, which Marx himself had developed, namely that if it is the case that the workers in a particular factory are militant and striking, then the capitalist doesn't expand that factory, he starts a new factory. Okay. So you have to therefore have two alternative approaches. One is that then the workers in both factories can get together under a common union, which basically means that you should have international trade unions as opposed to simply national. But that is not easy to organize. And what is more, if we are thinking in terms of a resistance by workers and peasants, there is no peasant organization internationally. Even if workers' organization internationally is feasible, peasant organization internationally is extremely difficult.
Sir, what is your
the alternative, the second way is therefore for the country to de-link itself from global capital flows. And that you can do by getting out of the neoliberal regime. And that's what I had in mind when I mentioned all this business of having 5 fundamental economic rights. The moment you have these rights, finance will start flowing out. And if it starts flowing out, you put control on finance. If you put control on finance, you have got out of the neoliberal regime.
Sir, what is your take on speculative capitalism or casino capitalism?
But this is, when capital I say is mobile, particularly finance, I'm not now talking about capital that sets up factories here and there. When finance is mobile for speculative reasons. A very important motivation for finance to move from one country to another is speculation.
Okay, sir.
Sir, why don't we have a worker-peasant alliance in such a massively populated country? On the one hand, we can fight against these neoliberal policies. On the other, we can build up an alternative of cooperative production, cooperative distribution and consumption. That could be a new civilization breaking through the eyes of neo-fascism and its economic reasons.
I entirely agree, but the Worker-Peasant Alliance is not a new idea. It was started by Lenin. 1907, 2 Tactics of Social Democracy is talking about a Worker-Peasant Alliance. The Worker-Peasant Alliance has been at the core of all left thinking about revolutionary transformation in societies like ours, where the peasantry is a very numerous force.
That is true, but in those days it was against Tsarism and...
No, it can be against neoliberalism, because after all, the recent peasant agitation for one whole year that took place was against neoliberalism. It was not against any feudalism.
That is true, but now we can have a constructive way of building up cooperative production, marketing, consumption together.
I agree. In fact, that's exactly what is being thought about by the peasant movement, all the Sanjukta Kishan Morcha and so on, and also the trade unions are joining in it. So this idea you're talking about is an idea that is already doing the rounds.
Okay, thank you.
Sir, don't 90% of the whole population of the world is affected by this fascism and neoliberalism and capitalism. the same people are again and again voting for the capitalists when they are coming to power. How this dilemma is happening? What is the psychology behind that?
A friend of mine who's a philosopher has this view that basically people have different frames. Okay, in one frame you can be anti-capitalist, but in another frame you can actually go and vote for the capitalists. In other words, it's not as if you're using a common frame. Making people have a common frame is in fact the effect of political education. Okay. Now the point is that, for instance, many of the persons who were involved in that year-long peasant agitation went and voted precisely for the same government, okay, which had brought in the 3 infamous farm laws. That's because of the fact that, you know, that we have disjoint frames for looking at the different things. When we have a common frame for looking at them, that is when we acquire political maturity, and that's when you have the emergence of praxis. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Of course that happens. All social change happens when suddenly, for a variety of reasons, people begin to see things and people rise up. There are long periods in history when people don't rise up but go back. But on the other hand, there are periods in history. I'm not just talking about the Bolshevik Revolution in our own country. I mentioned 1930s. Anti-colonial struggle was a massive upheaval of people. Okay. Generally, it is suggested that Gandhiji or Nehru and so on, we concentrate on leaders, but don't forget there was an enormous upsurge of popular support and popular uprising for it. And that is something which arose because people suddenly had a common frame in terms of which they would look at social and economic reality. All agitation, all political education, etc., is meant to bring about that common frame. It will succeed at some point, but not necessarily always.
Well, good evening, Mr. Patnaik. Thank you so much for that talk. I really enjoyed it. There were 2 points that you mentioned that really stuck out to me. You mentioned about how today's world, global capital is at the most mobile it's ever been. And you also mentioned about how international companies that go into economies in other countries are pushing very quickly for the development of technology that they can use to extract profit. Those 2 points reminded me of a term I learned from Greek politician and economist Yanis Varoufakis, techno-feudalism, and how you know, the big tech companies are like lords and we're like serfs, that whole thing. My question is, with how you mentioned about how neoliberal capitalism is going through an extreme crisis, and it's reminding me of how Varoufakis mentioned that capitalism is dying and it's being replaced by a new form of, you know, capitalism, techno-feudalism. I wanted to ask if you think that this increasing need to pursue technologies with algorithms and AI and machines that run the stock markets, will there ever be a point where it can be used to destroy neoliberal capitalism, or will it simply fuel us into an infinite neo-fascism?
No, but you see, if you have one of the most significant effects of artificial intelligence is the amount of unemployment it would generate. That kind of unemployment, that would happen in a capitalist society. Of course, if you had socialism, in that case, you could have everybody reducing the workload and being employed at the same time and getting the same wage as they were doing before. But on the other hand, in capitalism, it would give rise to unemployment. Because it gives rise to unemployment, wages would not rise. There would be a huge reserve army of labor. And because of that, there would be an acute distress as far as people are concerned. This is something which I have a feeling that even neoliberal capitalism is afraid of, because quite a few businessmen have been warning about it. Because if neoliberal capitalism introduces it, it would be like an economic genocide perpetrated against the working people. And I think we in India should be sufficiently aware of the dangers of artificial intelligence in this particular sense. The other point which you mentioned, you see, it is, okay, technological progress is one part of the story. The other part of the story, which I do not want you to underestimate, is the power of finance. You see, the very mobility of finance. You know, I was talking about fascism, but the very fact of a country being entrapped in this world of mobile finance is itself a subversion of democracy. Fascism comes on top of that, but it is itself a subversion of democracy, because if you wish to do anything, in that case, finance would flow out, and therefore you would be forced to come back, you know, to retract. Therefore, sovereignty of the people, which is the core of democracy, is substituted under neoliberal capitalism by the sovereignty of globalized finance. I'll give you one example. When South Africa got rid of apartheid and Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, at that time, every day, huge amounts of funds used to be taken out of South Africa because finance was mobile. Previous government had ensured. And therefore, Nelson Mandela was forced to appoint as his finance minister the same man who had been the finance minister under the apartheid government, a man called Derek Keyes. And that is symptomatic of the fact that he was telling globalized finance, don't worry, we are not going to make such drastic changes that your position would be jeopardized. I'm not saying this in criticism of Mandela. All I'm saying is that this is the reality of a nation state caught in the midst of a vortex of global financial flows.
Hi, sir. I'm doing a research in one of the mechanized fishing sectors in Kerala. So from my study, what I'm observing is that the native fishers in the mechanized fishing sector, as part of the capitalist transformation of the fisheries and the resultant enclosure within the coastal commons, have decided to leave their occupation of fishing and migrated to the Gulf countries. And as a result of this, the interstate migrant laborers from the northern Indian states and the neighboring state of Tamil Nadu have become the major working force in this particular place. And as a result of this migration, the native fishers who went to Gulf and the interstate migrant laborers who have come to Kerala, both of them are able to make certain kind of economic mobility. And in the case of local fishers, they are also making some kind of social mobility also. So how do we account for this economic and social mobility for which neoliberalism provides a path?
But this is a forced mobility. In fact, I'll give you, I used to work in Kerala for 5 years. Many of the fishermen abandoned their traditional occupation and used to seek work under MGNREGS. Now, when a fisherman abandons his occupation and looks for work under MGNREGS, that is a symptom of the crisis to which he has been pushed. So that, when you say that, okay, they migrate to Gulf, others come there and so on, you have to look at the underlying situation. The very fact of people coming all the way from UP or whatever you say, Tamil Nadu, to this place, migration is not a pleasant job. Migration implies abandoning your family, often. Migration implies personal pain and anguish. If you've seen Gaman, the film of Muzaffar Ali, that touches upon some of these things. That it is forced migration. People are forced to. Maybe by coming here, they get a bit more money than they got when they were back home. But that's because a large number of people are still back home. They don't come here. If the entire reserve army of labor from UP moved to Kerala, in that case, you wouldn't find any better improvement in the condition of living. So you have to really look at the underlying phenomenon. Migration, if somebody wants to come to Kerala because it's a beautiful place and so on, fine. But if somebody has to come to Kerala because of the fact that he doesn't have a job at home, in that case, that is the real problem.
Professor, we are caught between some sort of an illusion and reality. We are going to be the fourth largest economy in the world. And more people are falling below the poverty line, which is the illusion, which is the reality. Another thing is, another aspect is the more the GDP, we expect that the per capita GDP will go high. But more the GDP here in India, more and more people are falling below the poverty line. What is this?
Exactly. But I don't see why you're calling it illusion and reality. The government spreads illusion to hide the reality. The reality is extensive poverty. In fact, I would say growing poverty. I'll give you some figures if you like to establish my claim. Let me give you an instance. In my state, Odisha, in the old days, there was a Maharaja who built a palace based on what is called begar labor. You know what begar is? Yeah, you know that you don't pay anything. You simply get all the fellows to come and work free for you. He built a palace based on begar labor. Now that palace would enter the GDP. But on the other hand, that increase in GDP is nothing to be proud of. On the contrary, that's actually a social ill that the palace got built. So the point is, forget about GDP. In fact, I think today Bala has written a piece in the Hindu middle page saying that GDP is no good to look at. But the point is that if you look at poverty, again, you know, I mean, poverty, hundreds of different descriptions and so on, criteria. I'll take simply one criterion. The criterion which the government itself used to have in the old days. Namely, do people have access to enough calories? In rural areas, the government of India, this is the government of India Planning Commission criterion. Planning Commission used to say that if in rural India you have access to 2200 calories per person per day, then you're not poor. In urban areas, if you have access to 2100 calories per person per day, then you're not poor. If you define poverty in that sense, in 1993-4, the proportion of the population of rural India that was poor, that means didn't have access to 2200 calories per person per day, was 58%. It went up to 68% by 2011-12, and by 2017-18, it was in excess of 80%, well over 80%. In urban India, it was 57%, 65%, and had come down a bit to about 60% by 2017-18. 2017-18 data was so bad that the Modi government decided to suppress it. Now the point is that it is not surprising that India is 115th in the World Hunger Index and so on. You may say that hunger doesn't matter and so on. But I'm just taking one. You can take women suffering from anemia. The fact that half the population of women, according to a sample survey carried out by a government organization, 60% in fact suffers from anemia. You know, these are all telling statistics. You know, so in the presence of these telling statistics, when I hear people say that, oh, it will become a $5 trillion economy, that we are having the fastest growth rate in the world and so on, it just makes me kind of sick.
So in 2024, around 60 countries are going for election. So more than half the population of the world is going to election. And at the same time, in all these countries, as you said, the neo-rebellists, with the help of these fascist regimes, almost, I think, going to be back in power. And if people are thinking so, is it because people just need their basic, like roti makan or kapada, or are they so self-centered, or how it's going to make a difference?
Well, it's going to make a very big difference mind you, it's not, I mean, okay, what is happening in Bangladesh, where the opposition is crushed, has to be slightly distinguished from what's happening in India, because in Bangladesh, it is not associated with the development of the concept of a hated other. We are not aware, at least, of there being a hated other, while in India there is. So I would not call what is happening in Bangladesh fascism. No, I would call it authoritarianism. In fact, there's a distinction you have to draw between fascism on the one hand and authoritarianism. Leon Trotsky talked of Bonapartism and all kinds of things. So, but those and fascism are really quite distinct things. What is disturbing is that large numbers of countries are now thinking in terms of fascism or voting to power governments which are fascist, which are not only anti-working class and pro-monopoly, but which also at the same time have this concept of the other, othering a particular minority group. This is happening in large numbers of countries, and I find that extremely worrying. The point is, of course, people vote for it, but on the other hand, this voting, as I said, is not something which is permanent. It's not as if they would continue to vote for these governments. It happens because of propaganda, because of money power, because of all kinds of things. There may be elections in which the fascists may actually get elected. But on the other hand, the point is to make sure that there are other elections where when they lose, and also when they lose, to make sure that they do not come back again by changing the conjuncture that makes them relevant. See what I mean?
Thank you.
ജനാധിപത്യം എങ്ങനെ മരിക്കുന്നു, നവ ഉദാരീകരണവും ഫാഷിസവും എന്ന വിഷയത്തിൽ പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക് നടത്തിയ പ്രഭാഷണം സമാപിച്ചു. We express our sincere thanks to Mr. Prabhat Patnaik for his intellectual and creative talk on how democracy dies, neoliberalism and fascism. Thank you, sir.